What are India's plans for expanding nuclear energy? Because the global nuclear industry is looking at India as a big lucrative market. And all these reports are saying that although nuclear power is in decline in the first world, Asian countries like India and China is going in a big way.
You are listening to TMI for the week of March 18th, 2019. On the show today, non-proliferation and nuclear industry researcher, the founder of dianuke.org, Kumar Sundaram. Even the scandals that are happening in the Trump regime,
Yes.
Flynn, for example, he was the front man or somehow going to make money off deals. We have the SNC-Lavalin scandal, which we could touch on. But it's just interesting to me that in the news, it's a political scandal of who said what to who and who knew what when. And it's never going to be about the implications of this corporation that's out of control, that's too big to fail, and that it's got its arms in all of these things like nuclear. And nuclear is this wonderful example of an interface between lobbyists, corporations, and the government. And we see it everywhere. And so it's no surprise that in the middle of this whole Trump, the more we learn, the more we hear about deals with Russia, and Russia's in one of the remaining few players on the nuclear market with its VVERs and of the past and trying to Rosatom, and they're essentially competing with dying entities like Areva, Westinghouse, and the other big players internationally, and so of course there's going to be a corrupt politician making some money off the side. So my question is, one of the announcements that I saw on your website, dianuke.org, was this recent deal by the United States to sell reactors to India. Can you expand on that?
Definitely. The India-US nuclear deal has been in offing for more than a decade now. And the statement which was made earlier this week means at one level it's a reiteration, but it also means that the Trump administration and in India the Modi regime, which is although lame duck now, they are pushing hard with this deal. And one of the contentious issues that has been is that India has had a Nuclear Liability Act, which allows for a provision that in case of an accident, Indian citizens, through the operator, not directly, can claim liability. U.S. has been bitterly against any such provision, and the American government has been pressurizing the Indian government for a long time now to do away with this particular clause 17B of our 2010 Nuclear Liability Act. Now, the current regime that we have in India is more than willing to go along that way, and that's how these two governments have been trying to sell American reactor at a time when the nuclear lobbies are in a terminal crisis in the West. So India is a big market for them.
International corporations that export nuclear technologies of any form will not do business with a country that doesn't have a standard, quote, Nuclear Liability Act. In the United States, it's called the Price-Anderson Act. In Canada, it's the Nuclear Liability Act. And so there was a difference about the way it was written in India that American corporations weren't. And so their workaround temporarily was to Westinghouse sell supplies and parts, because in almost all nuclear liability law, the exclusion is to vendors. Vendors are not liable in a nuclear accident. So that's why they still want to do business with India. Is there progress towards amending the Nuclear Liability Act to be friendlier to corporations like Westinghouse?
Although the government is trying hard, but that has not been possible because of the citizens' protests.
Okay.
And also because the Modi government in India does not have majority in the upper house of the parliament. So, but the Indian government has tried its own workarounds to do away with the liability provisions. Indian liability law is something that makes the international lobbies unhappy. The international lobbies have been pushing for the CSC, which is the complementary, the Convention on Supplementary Compensation. And that they have been pushing as a template, and they want all governments to adopt that as a liability law domestically. But in India in 2010, because of the pressure from below, the government has promulgated a law, enacted a law, which has a clear provision for liability for vendors and suppliers. And that stands as a big irritant for the American lobby, for the Russian lobbies. The French have been clearly saying that they are unhappy with the Indian nuclear liability law.
Nobody likes it.
Nobody likes nuclear liability. And on part of the citizens, we have been saying this reflects that you do not have confidence in their own in your own product. If you're confident about the safety of your product, and if you want people of India, which means most vulnerable sections of Indian society, which means villagers and indigenous people, women, farmers, fisherfolk, people who are socially, economically backward. If you want them to put their lives on stake for your own project, why are you not putting your money on stake and assuring them of liability in case of an accident? So I think the whole liability issue is also some sort of dummy's guide to nuclear safety. The nuclear industry does not believe in the safety of its own product, and that's why, unlike any other industry, it's not ready to put its money. And that has led to the situation that the Indo-US nuclear deal, although the deal was in principle announced in 2008, and I can give you details of that original deal in a moment. But the situation is it's more than 10 years, and the governments have been trying to find a workaround. Originally, both these companies, GE and Westinghouse, they were provided in India one proposed site each, which will host 6 reactors each. So initially the plan was for 12 reactors. GE has clearly backed out, and they made an announcement a couple of years ago saying that the liability law is not acceptable for us. And also the state in which GE was given land in principle, there was massive protest, and the people were against the project. So the state government had also made an announcement that will not allow this project. The state government was forced to make this announcement. So GE has pulled out. The Westinghouse is continuing to pressure the governments to have its way. Now, there are 3 issues involved. One is that liability. Second, these are going to be really huge reactors in densely populated area in a country like India, which does not have an independent nuclear regulator. In India, the entire nuclear sector has developed as a inextricable corollary to the nuclear weapons industry, and it has complete unaccountability to people. It has complete insulation when it comes to regulation, complete irresponsibility towards environmental norms, towards safety norms and emergency preparedness, and on all these counts, the Indian nuclear sector escapes any accountability because they produce weapons for the country. Pushing these projects in India, they are able to escape all this, and that is one big reason why they are pushing these deals.
It's Westinghouse. Westinghouse has a problem with the nuclear liability law, but what they're really pushing is their AP1000.
AP1000,
which is a, I like to say, I say this on Twitter, is untested in a fuel accident. Which, anyway, and I have to say, I can't help but I was laughing to myself as you spoke, because you have a wonderful way of putting all of this, and it's very delightful. Okay, now let's talk about the regulator. So, the number one thing to be indicted at the beginning of every conversation about nuclear is regulatory capture. And so we here in Canada, we have the CNSC. So it's a hand-picked panel. Ultimately, it responds. It's sort of this division of the decision-making between federal and provincial, at least in the Ontario case. And the atom seems to be the purview of the CNSC. Ultimately, they answer to the minister of natural resources, I believe. But in India, it's a little bit different. There's two entities, and one answers to Parliament and a bunch of cabinet ministers, and then the regulator is it's like there's a middleman for the regulator.
Yes, you're right in a way. Atomic Energy Commission, which is supposed to be the overarching the bureaucracy for the entire nuclear sector, that is accountable directly to the Prime Minister. So in effect, India's entire nuclear industry comes directly under the Prime Minister's office. We have an entity called Atomic Energy Regulatory Board, which was set up in 1983. And it's totally incompetent. It's totally unaccountable. It's totally non-transparent and non-independent. The AERB, which is supposed to supervise and regulate the nuclear sector, not only it reports to Atomic Energy Commission, exactly the body which it is supposed to supervise, but it's also dependent, for its financial resources on the same industry. And secondly, even for the expertise, the Atomic Energy Regulatory Board depends on the nuclear industry, which is the Department of Atomic Energy, the Nuclear Power Corporation of India Limited, and Atomic Energy Commission. All these three are part of the bureaucracy which come directly under the Prime Minister. So when we speak about nuclear industry in India, there is nothing independent of the government. And it has been so since the beginning. And the prime factor behind this kind of organization is the fact that in India, military and civilian nuclear establishments are not separated.
So there's kind of a parallel right now we're seeing. After the crash of the Boeing MAX 8 737, it turns out that the regulatory board depends 100% on Boeing Corporation for specifications, information, testing equipment even, because I guess as a result of the complexity, but ultimately they're taking all of their direction right down to when they should impose a ban on the flights from Boeing itself. And it's this very similar, and another parallel is, of course, Boeing is part of the military-industrial complex. So it's another example of what we're talking about, a form of regulatory capture, essentially.
Yeah, so in a way, here in India, you have a country which is an underdeveloped third world country. It places a lot of optimism in scientific growth and technological advancement. And the whole post-independent Indian nation-building project, I mean, when it came out of the British colonial order, the governments after that have held the scientific establishment in really high spirit, which has meant that the nuclear industry has completely escaped any kind of democratic scrutiny. So neither the regulation is open and transparent and accountable, nor its funding is open to, budgetary scrutiny and transparency. So in India, nuclear industry works entirely within the government, and that is why when it comes to anti-nuclear movements, all these people like us who have been raising these questions, we have been labeled anti-national by the government. So in any other country, like, it's really hard for me to imagine that you are being called anti-national for questioning an industry, which is a civilian industry. So in any industry you can raise questions about safety and liability and accountability and transparency, but for raising these very, very basic questions questions pertaining to what happens to people who are displaced, what happens to impacts on their livelihood, what happens to the environmental, and why particularly for the nuclear industry, the entire system in India of environmental clearances have been turned into cruel joke. And if we raise these questions, people are labeled anti-national.
Okay.
So after Fukushima, on the southernmost tip of India, there's a place called Kudankulam, where India already has 2 reactors set up with Russian collaboration. These are VVER 1000 designs.
Mm-hmm.
And when people there started mobilizing themselves in tens of thousands, and these are farmers and fisherfolk whose livelihoods are at stake, whose safety and lives are at stake. The government of India labeled charges of sedition and war against the state and called them anti-national. Even today, after like 7-8 years, thousands of people in Kudankulam, these are all villagers, are required to report to the nearest police station after certain periods, and they are constantly kept under surveillance and watch, and they continue to face these fictitious cases of sedition. Now, sedition case and calling people anti-national, these are things which the British government used against our freedom fighters.
Right.
You know, and the colonial vintage law, which are still in place, it's a mockery of democracy that the Indian state resorts to this kind of repression against thoroughly peaceful grassroots dissent. This is the kind of nuclear industry that we are faced with in India.
People who care about their land and their community are heroes.
Yeah, exactly.
They're not terrorists. Here's my limited understanding of Canada and India as it applies to nuclear. Canadians were trying to export their Candu technology, and one of the places they sold some of it and got involved is India in the 60s. And this essentially led to India's establishment of its nuclear program.
Right. Yeah, that's true. So when as I said, like India, among the third world countries, have been one of the earliest countries which bought into the nuclear dream. And because our initial prime minister and other political leaders, they thought that this is the way to go, India sought cooperation from all these countries. Canada was ready to help. India gained also a lot from the U.S. Under the Atoms for Peace diplomacy of Eisenhower in the late 50s. Essentially, whatever we see in India, and they say it's indigenous, it's all built on Canadian design. India received Canadian support in 1950s and 60s, built Candu reactors, initially of very small sizes, but now India has built 500 megawatts of Candu design, and it's essentially a reverse engineered version of the same design that it received.
Okay.
What happens, and this history is important because India used this technical know-how and some of the material to manufacture its nuclear weapons and conducted nuclear tests in 1974.
Mm-hmm. Which led to an embargo.
Yes. Which led to an embargo from Canada and a lot of other countries, US, Britain, France, Russia. And in fact, this international system of safeguards to disallow countries which are indulging in proliferation, actually it evolved in response to the Indian experience. So what you see today as Nuclear Suppliers Group, what you see as today as all these kind of Wassenaar arrangement and all these agreements, they all evolved in 1970s in response to India's experience. But one of the biggest ironies today is because India is a lucrative market, because India is a country which is in good books of the U.S. India today is again allowed same kind of technology. So this big deal which happened in 2008 between India and U.S., it again embraced India into the international nuclear commerce, putting an end to this embargo, which started in 1974. There are two issues involved here. One is, in a world where everybody is obsessing about Iran, and Iran should not have nuclear weapons, and North Korea should not have nuclear weapons, here you are effectively rewarding a country for using foreign supply nuclear technology to manufacture weapons, and India continues to expand its nuclear arsenal. So here is completely a case of good nukes and bad nukes. So Indian nuclear weapons are good nuclear weapons because India is in our good books, and not so much Pakistan, and definitely not Iran and North Korea. So there are two issues involved here. One is complete hypocrisy on nuclear proliferation and nuclear weapons and nuclear disarmament. And being an Indian citizen, because I am opposed to nuclear weapons, I completely stand opposed to this hypocrisy. And secondly, by short-circuiting nuclear proliferation, you also open up market for your civilian nuclear industry, which is declining in your countries, and you find a market in a country like India.
Yeah.
So nuclear supplies to India from West, whether it's Canada or US, it undermines both non-proliferation regime and disarmament principles, and of course principles of nuclear safety liability. So in India, when Canada is helping today in India to build more nuclear weapons, and India, after this embargo was ended by George W. Bush in 2008, it allowed India again to have agreements with Canada. So India has had a massive uranium supply agreement with Canada after 2008. Westinghouse is now owned by a Canadian company. So all these kind of, and there are several smaller entities which are engaged in expanding nuclear power in India. And similar agreement India has done with Japan, with a number of members of the so-called nuclear suppliers group. So what I want to definitely highlight, that any supply of nuclear technology to India, it undermines both the nuclear disarmament and nuclear restraint regime globally. It creates a bad precedent because you are creating a completely wrong example by rewarding a proliferator, weapons proliferator on the one hand, and you are destroying lives of tens of thousands of people who are vulnerable, who are being, repressed by their government to force these nuclear reactors down their throat. So there are both things involved here, disarmament and democracy.
By 1971, Canada was also selling nuclear technology to Pakistan.
Yes.
And I had got my facts wrong in the past. I had suggested that after this 1974 nuclear test by India, despite its promises to not use that technology for weapons, I thought Canada then jumped in and started selling nuclear reactors to Pakistan, which essentially then would historically, upon reflection, show that Canada profited from creating an arms race between Pakistan and India. But we had already started. We had jumped the hoop on that and started selling to Pakistan by 1971. But what I want to ask you is, just a week or two ago, while Trump was in Vietnam talking to Kim Jong-un, things really heated up between Pakistan and India.
Yeah, I think that's very important to discuss. India and Pakistan today are only two countries on the earth which have contentious border and border conflict which has been ongoing in hot and cold forms over the last 70 years, and countries possessing nuclear arms. So nuclear armed countries engaged in a continuous border conflict that's happening only in South Asia. Even though the West tends to and prefers to believe that North Korea is a bigger threat, they are completely overlooking the fact that here is India and Pakistan, and both these countries are buying weapons from the West. So this, in a way, is actively fueling arms race in the most populated region of the world, where both these government and, as you know, in India, you have these Hindu fundamentalists who are on rise. In Pakistan, there are extremists and Islamists on the rise. So this is a huge contention going on in South Asia, and it has a very clear nuclear dimension. After 1998 test, at least there are 2 times in recorded history where both these countries have seriously pondered over using nuclear weapons against each other. Thirdly, in the past 20 years, since the 1998 nuclear tests, both in India and Pakistan, the nuclear arsenal and the overall military arsenal has grown exponentially. So India today has the so-called nuclear triad, meaning it has capabilities to deliver nuclear attack from land-based missiles to sea-based missiles and air-based missiles. India is also going ahead with some kind of national missile defense program, which I think is a complete delusion. On the other hand, you have Pakistan, which is now investing heavily in the so-called tactical nuclear weapons or battlefield nuclear weapons. So they are miniaturizing their nuclear weapons to be able to use them as in conventional warfare. So this makes the situation in India, Pakistan completely precarious. And countries like Canada, who are engaged in, otherwise at least claim to have a democratic, pro-human rights and liberal foreign policy, they should use their diplomatic leverage to exercise some restraint in South Asia. But on the other hand, what we see is from the US, from Europe, from the entire West, no rethinking about the whole profit mongering which happens in the military industry. When it comes to nuclear, yes, the supplies from Canada and US as of now are safeguarded by IAEA. So India cannot use directly the uranium that it's getting from Canada for weapons purposes. But there are 2 things. One is that the technology it has already acquired with Canadian assistance has helped it in making nuclear weapons. Secondly, and this has direct consequences. Secondly, because Canada supplies uranium to India, and this uranium used only in safeguarded reactors where we have IAEA inspections which will make sure that this uranium will not be used for weapons purposes, or the plutonium which will come from the reactors where this uranium is being used will not be used for weapon purposes. What effectively also happens at the same time is the entire domestic uranium reserve of India now is free for using in weapons purposes. Mm-hmm. So by supplying uranium to India, what you are doing is you are allowing pressure. India to run its civilian reactors on imported fuel and use entire domestic reserve that India has, and it has a lot substantial supply. So earlier we were fueling our civilian reactors from domestic uranium, but now India is, at least in principle, it can channel all its domestic uranium to weapons manufacturing, and that's definitely a direct effect of supplying uranium, more technology, more military hardware to India. The US and Canada are, in a way, standing on the wrong side of history when the nuclear conflict is taking place in South Asia.
This would be a good opportunity for the Canadian government to enforce some pressure to restrict India's pursuit of weaponry in its conflict with Pakistan. But it's just always interesting that if you doubt the amount of pressure that the nuclear industry might have on Justin Trudeau, we can look once again to SNC-Lavalin, where they actually hold the assets and licenses of Candu. We gifted Candu to SNC-Lavalin. I heard for $15 million, but I've also been told for $1. So it's just funny how if you doubt that there might be some pressure on Justin Trudeau not to weigh in on nuclear proliferation. It's just interesting. I'm just saying, it's always, every time you look a little closer, it's always corporations and nuclear and politicians.
That's true. So it's pretty disappointing for us to see that countries like Canada are in a way actively fueling nuclear and military arms race in South Asia. They go completely silent on the human rights abuses against activists and minorities and dissident voices when it happens to South Asia. Otherwise, they are quick to use the human rights diplomacy in other cases, but not when it comes to India and Pakistan.
Another thing I was interested in was that I was always curious as to there's a new nuclear build in the UK. And right from the start, it was clear that the Chinese were funding it. And I thought, isn't that strange? But then it turned out I learned that almost all of the Canadian Candu reactors we've exported to countries abroad, we also offer the financing. So we do the same thing.
Yeah, that's true. So funding is a huge issue, like that Hinkley Point reactor in UK and several projects like that. China is actively funding. So again, like one way to look at it is countries like India and China, which have their nuclear industry within the government, which do not allow any kind of scrutiny and auditing and so on. These are the countries which have become rehabilitation ground for the global nuclear industry. So if it is a really advanced science and it's the next things that humanity should do, why not? Why isn't the nuclear industry welcome in democratic countries? Why isn't the nuclear industry allowing more scrutiny, more transparency? So in a way, it's also very instructive for me that most undemocratic states today are pursuing nuclear technology. It's an outdated technology. It can be pursued only when you silence all other voices and you don't allow any transparency.
Let me throw Canada in there. So just for example, a couple examples. So just so happens the only place Canada is really exporting any Candu reactors is China. And there's your SNC-Lavalin again.
Exactly.
Number two, Canada has, my math is a little bad, but let's call it 20 nuclear reactors, one running in New Brunswick. There's 12 provinces and territories, and the only one that's got the nuclear reactors with 18 in Ontario. And so why aren't they in? Well, Quebec had 2. They shut them down. Every other province, no nuclear reactors. There's only one real project proceeding now, and everybody's expecting it will be canceled, and that's the Vogtle proposed plant in the United States. So, and the only sort of other real example is, as you said, Hinkley, and they're not even paying for it themselves. Nobody will put the money in.
So in today's world, nuclear industry is able to survive only in places where there's democratic deficit, where there's complete non-transparency. So this technology, which started with the promise of unmetered and a bright future for humanity, etc., is now able to prosper only in the darkest corners of the world. Most undemocratic, most non-transparent, and places where there are Aboriginal communities who can be silenced, places where there are vulnerable people who can be on whose livelihoods you can thrust these projects. So to me, nuclear industry today is completely it's a force of darkness.
I've equated it to the end of the steam era or the dying lead paint industry or the asbestos industry. But anyway, I noticed on your website an ad for something I'm familiar with, the Sayonara Nukes, which is a book that's been translated by Dennis Riches.
Yeah, Dennis has been wonderful. So he, after Fukushima, has contributed a number of articles for the website. And one way in which I have been running the website is to invite experts from different fields to be guest editors. So I think in 2018, for 3 months, Dennis was guest editing my website, and I have done that on a number of occasions, and I have requested other experts to do the same. So Dennis published a number of articles then, and he had its own wonderful blog, which I think everybody should follow, where he writes about nuclear issues in Japan, and where he writes about a number of other democratic struggles and international politics and history and so on. So when he came up with a book, which is compilation of his articles on his blogs, and it's a wonderful book. So yes, we have been promoting this book. This is not a commercial promotion or advertisement. This is because we are committed. We have similar goals. So on the website, Dennis Risher's book is promoted.
And it's on Amazon.com. We'll put the link in our show notes.
Yes.
People who want to learn more, obviously, they should go to dianuke.org. It's dianuke.org. And you can even just Google that. It'll pull up the webpage I found.
Yes. So I started the website after Fukushima, and I'm glad that a lot of activists from India and independent experts, including at least one former regulator who has been voicing his concerns and reservations, he has contributed articles on the website. A number of other experts and also people from outside India have written for the website. So in the past 8 years, it has been good, reputed platforms where activists and experts and journalists, they write about nuclear issues. So I'm really open and welcoming suggestions, contributions. And we are a very small team, me and Dennis and other friends, and we have been running this website.
India has 22 plants. 16 of them are small. And are they pressurized heavy water reactors? Yeah.
Yes, all the nuclear plants that India has, most of them are PHWRs, pressurized heavy water reactors.
Yeah.
And as I said earlier, these are all reverse engineered version of Candu.
Yeah.
Except a couple like in Tarapur, we have GE Mark I reactor, which was supplied by the US. It's exactly the same design which was operating in Fukushima.
Yeah, well, there's one of those right across the lake from us here in Toronto.
Same design, but it's still working in India. The post-Fukushima safety audit in India was a joke because not an independent agency, not the government independently, the Nuclear Power Corporation, which is the operator, and it's a government sector operator, the NPCIL itself conducted a post-Fukushima nuclear safety audit, and never really implemented its own recommendations.
The equivalent here in Ontario is, so that would be like OPG. They own the reactors, and with the exception of Bruce, they sort of operate them. Is that what I'm sorry, just give me a second.
NPCIL,
right.
Nuclear Power Corporation of India Limited.
So they own the reactors and operate them?
Yeah, they own all the reactors in India, and they operate them.
Okay.
And when it came to post-Fukushima safety audit, they did the audit themselves. Yeah. They made certain recommendations, but they never really implemented them.
Right.
The government also made an announcement that they're going to set up a new and more independent nuclear regulator. There's a bill in the Indian Parliament, Nuclear Safety Regulatory Authority Bill, NSRA bill, which is lying there for the past 6-7 years. So even after Fukushima, our nuclear regulator did not really become independent.
Okay, and an American parallel of that is the FLEX program, which was lessons learned after Fukushima, essentially in the United States, and the NRC came up with some fixes that would reduce the impacts of a fuel accident and the industry was not forced to carry them out because it would hurt them financially.
Exactly. So in India, the industry and regulators and owners, everything falls within the government. So there were only announcement and no real implementation. So responding to your question, yes, India has 22 reactors. Most of them are small, except a few which are 500 megawatts each. But India has massive expansion plans. So in terms of countries which are building new reactors or have their nuclear construction projects in place, India today stands among a very small list of very few countries which are pushing ahead with these plans. And at least 10 new places have been identified where India has plans to build new reactors. One of the places is in Jaitapur, on the western coast of India. And India is going to set up world's largest reactor there, 9,900 megawatt. And this would include 6 EPRs of 1,650 megawatt each. And this plan has got delayed because EPR is in trouble in Europe itself. The French nuclear industry is in a meltdown. But otherwise, India is a country, although it has small capacity as of now, the ambitions are huge, which we should be concerned about.
So nuclear is 2.15% of India's electricity demand. And so 16 of the 22 plants are these pressurized heavy water reactors. So one of the reasons I ask about that is that where there's smoke, there's fire. Where there's Candu heavy water technology, there's tritium. Is that in the news? Is this something that people talk about?
Yes, that's an interesting question. Like about heavy water, we have had regular leaks in all Indian reactors. And at least in 2013, there was a major tritium leak in Rawat which hosts these bigger pressurized heavy water reactors of 500 megawatt each. And 34 workers, again contractual workers, were exposed to a heavy dose of tritium. But the government did a complete cover-up. And because these were contractual workers, they were given some initial treatment and they are so vulnerable for the basic requirements and all. So there was complete brazen lies peddled in the media about the tritium leaks. After that, also, there's a reactor in southern India called Kaiga, where someone unknowingly or knowingly, maybe there are different theories. Some people say it was a mischief. But essentially, in the water tank from where workers get their drinking water, somebody had put a tritium pipe there. And so a number of workers were exposed to tritium there. So tritium exposures are a routine feature in nuclear industry. The media doesn't talk about it much because the nuclear industry, the NPCIL does great work of covering up. The workers occasionally come out and speak. These are mostly contractual workers who are really vulnerable.
Okay, so I have to throw the Canadian equivalent in. So at Bruce Nuclear, there are wells, test wells on site. One of them shows 50,000 becquerels per liter of tritium in the water tested, and it's WSH 231. Anyway, so where there's How much is this talked about in the news? Are people engaged in this as an issue? Is there some resentment for the billions? I mean, the money comes in the billion by the billion. India has other things it should be spending its money on.
Right. Yes and no. Like when we talk about the anti-nuclear movement in India, although it's massive and very strong at the grassroots, the reality is that it remains confined in the areas where we have existing nuclear power plants and people are suffering, or around the uranium mines, or the protest of the contractual workers, and the resentment and protests by the communities where new reactors are being planned. So it remains a grassroots protest. When it comes to the urban centers, the middle classes, they don't care where their electricity is coming from. They want American-style development, so there have to be highways and big malls and big industries and so on. So although there are huge problems in existing and upcoming reactors in India, it has not become a big issue in the media. Occasionally it does when there's a strong grassroots protest. But responding to your question, the Indian middle classes remain complacent with this nuclear dream, and they somehow think that these Aboriginal people, the rural people, they're expendable.
What would happen if there was a micro feed-in tariff for small solar in India? Wouldn't it be the Middle East of solar technology?
Definitely. And a number of people have said that. Government's own committees and studies have brought out this fact that India has immense potential for renewable technologies. And because it's a huge country, we have sun shining over us for most part of the year. So we can do great with solar. There are parts in India, there are regions where wind can be really useful. So definitely this is the way to go. But there are big lobbies and big money involved in the nuclear construction. Similarly, also in the coal sector, there's big industries which are funding all our political parties. So the reason why the government and the policymakers do not think of expanding solar and other renewable technologies is not because they are not aware of these facts, is not because they do not know about the potential. It's definitely the influence of the big lobbies and big money.
Okay, let's go back to the 50s for a minute, because it seems to be the moment that you start steps in one direction versus other directions. A curiosity is sort of thorium, and coming with that curiosity is this pursuit of heavy water design, right, which can use a uranium that is essentially got a lower percentage of, it has less 235 in it, so it's less enriched. It's got a lower percentage of fissile material in your natural ore.
Yes.
Now, that's why you didn't pursue the reactors that require 5 or more percent fissile material.
Right.
And this desire to use local uranium pushed you towards the heavy water design. But I was always interested that one of the big players in thorium, the molten salt reactor designs, dates back to the 50s in India, that your country was looking into these weird forms of reactors from early on.
That's true. So India still has that mythology of thorium reactors floating around. And what Indian nuclear establishment essentially believes is a 3-stage nuclear program. And the uranium-fueled heavy water moderated reactors, the PHWRs, are the first stage, and they expected that they will build a massive number of these first stage uranium reactors, enough so that they get adequate amount of plutonium for running again the second stage, which is the fast breeder reactors. So India, although fast breeder reactors have practically been abandoned by all major countries, France had Phoenix program. Japan had fast breeder reactors, which it abandoned. But India continues to pursue fast breeder reactor. And ultimately, all these 2 stages had to lead to the thorium stage, where the plutonium which will come from the fast breeders,
right,
which will be used and mixed with the thorium, which is in abundance on South Indian Ocean sand.
Okay.
So the initial dream was India will have unfettered access to unlimited energy because we have abundance of thorium.
Right.
But to reach that thorium reactor, and even now, in principle, the Indian government has not abandoned this three-stage plan, and all its announcements, all major pronouncements start with, invoking these three-stage dream. So that still remains on the horizon forever for the nuclear industry. So it's a science fiction that they really believe in it, but it is a fiction ultimately. But because they have not had a successful stage one, because of the sanctions and the other problems, and the fast breeder reactor program is also a big failure. They have one fast breeder reactor in South India in Kalpakkam, which is 50 megawatts, and they have this is prototype fast breeder reactor. The another fast breeder reactor, which has a capacity of 500 megawatt, for the last 8 or 10 years at least, every year they say we are starting in the next year. So that's the story of India's fast breeder program. Science fiction.
I think one of the agreements that India is involved in bars it from reprocessing and enrichment.
When the U.S. removed the embargo against India in 2008, one of the conditions was that these foreign supplied technology foreign supplied fuel cannot be reprocessed. And the energy countries will not supply enrichment technologies to India. But India, as I said in response to one of the questions, that it's free to reprocess all the domestic fuel and to use it for fast breeder reactors or for making weapons. So India has reprocessing technology. India also has advanced enrichment technologies. The only thing is it cannot use foreign imported uranium for these purposes. But as I said, this also means that India can run all its civilian reactors using foreign imported fuel. But it does have enough uranium, enough reprocessing units to make more and more plutonium.
Find us on Twitter @ThatArcher, our podcast page, tmi.twxnet.com. Rate the show on iTunes. It changes the way the show is listed.
The Indian government recently, in the past couple of years, has been pushing nuclear technology in a big way by claiming that it's a solution to climate change.
Right.
Now it's an important issue. Climate change is something that we should all be concerned about. And that's precisely the reason why we should not fall for non-solutions and false solutions. Right. Nuclear technology is a completely false solution, particularly in case of India, where the most vulnerable communities are at the receiving end of the problems which have been unleashed by climate change. And if you are giving them more displacement, more destruction, more nuclear waste to grapple with, and if you are promoting it as a solution, that's a big irony. And in a country like India, which has limited resources, what has happened is the NPCIL and some of the retired senior officials from the Atomic Energy Commission, they have been calling for the nuclear industry being able to use green funds, the environmental funds, and that will be a travesty. Mm-hmm. So we have been saying a big no to this peddling of nuclear power as a climate change solution, and a big no to using green funds for something as toxic as nuclear.
That's their number one goal these days, is trying to be lumped in with green forms of generation. But more so than pushing the atoms for peace or talking about the density of the energy or minimizing the effects, their number one hope.
Yes.
And the other interesting thing is just in the case of the existing nuclear reactors in the United States, it's bailout after bailout. It's just one state at a time. And I think they've even timed it. They haven't all come forward at once asking for their $1 to $5 billion bailouts. Every 6 weeks, it's another state with another nuclear reactor owner saying, if you don't give us $1 to $5 billion, we're closing down next month.
Right.
And then this is the story of the nuclear industry as it sits now. Projects that run years beyond their completion promise, that the only way they can get funding for them is to hold captive local ratepayers trapped in a monopoly as the only way to get their money, exactly. Or foreign countries loaning the money to build the reactors, and then those reactors coming in by the billions, and in some cases tens of billions of dollars over budget. So it can't be the solution for any climate change solution. You add on the number of years between go ahead and the power being turned on, we don't have that kind of time.
True. So for all these reasons, nuclear technology is definitely not a solution to climate change. Nuke has been exposing these claims, and we are part of an international campaign called Don't Nuke the Climate. I was myself in COP meetings and have been campaigning in India and outside. So at this juncture, we must all come together and expose this completely fraudulent claim that somehow nuclear technology is going to solve climate change.
So here's another thing. I wanted to ask you, are there public hearings before the regulator where the public can get involved and voice their concerns? In the nuclear sector in India, Unfortunately, no. Okay.
But when it comes to the nuclear lobbies accessing green funds, there we have some opportunities. So we have raised objections with the Ministry of Forest and Environment, and we are liaising with other groups and citizens who are concerned with climate change. So we can work with the Ministry of Environmental and Forest and Climate Change in India and try to stop this arrangement that they're trying to set up of using green funds for nuclear. So there we have a little more openness.
And how is wind as an industry in India?
Wind has a lot of potential, especially in the South India, both onshore and offshore. There have been pilot projects. There have been multiple success stories. So wind is definitely promising.
And India is broken up in a similar way with provinces. Is that right?
Yeah. So we have like these 29 provinces. And when it comes to powers, these states, we call them states, they have their own autonomy, so they can come up with policies which incentivize and promote renewable. That's what we should be doing.
But when it comes to the nuclear industry in India, the owner and operator, is that seen as a federal? That's associated with the federal government?
In nuclear, everything is under the government and everything is centralized. So it's a completely undemocratic structure. Everything is pushed from New Delhi, the capital.
Okay.
And the states have to obey and all authorities have to obey.
So one of the things I thought was weird about nuclear in Canada was that, as I said, all of our reactors are concentrated in one province. It's a federal operation in terms of the regulation and the responsibility for the fuel ultimately. A lot of the costs associated with nuclear are actually federal, and I just find it interesting. A tiny little province like PEI. It's probably no truth in it, but the idea that states or provinces that don't have nuclear are essentially, one wonders, subsidizing the ones that do.
Right.
I wonder if that happens in India.
Yeah. So in India, we have a complete top-down structure.
Yeah.
If state had a little more say, probably there was a possibility of mobilizing state-level politics and policy making in more saner directions. But unfortunately, that's not the case in India.
Dennis Riches had mentioned you a couple times, so I've been wanting to get you on for a while.
Okay. Well, thank you for reaching out, Dave.
And so a great source of news as it's evolving, not just associated with India, dayanuke.org.
Yes.
And you're on Facebook as, I think it's dayanuke.org.
Yes.
And
we
you're
have a
on
Facebook page, dayanuke.org. We have a good following on Twitter as well.
Okay, but on Twitter, you're at dayanuke_org.
Yes, that's true.
A great source of information for people who want to learn more. What do you think coming up the issues will be? You say that the Indian government plans to expand and build more reactors moving forward. That's just going to become a hotter and hotter issue. Have things died down in tensions between India and Pakistan? Is that story over with for now?
It has gone away from the news headlines. Doesn't mean the story has gone down. Actually, the entire escalation was engineered because we have federal elections coming up.
Okay.
And the ruling party, the Bharatiya Janata Party, which is also a Hindu right-wing, Hindu majoritarian nationalist party, so to say, they have been using pictures of this confrontation, and they have been using pictures of soldiers in their electoral campaigns. So in India, the direct confrontation or border conflict, etc., they actually punctuate usual jingoist nationalist rhetoric and build-up. So there's always this possibility that it will suit the politicians and they'll start a conflict again. But we should all be concerned because South Asia, as I said, is a much more dangerous region than North Korea and other kind of challenges which Trump thinks he are the biggest challenges. But the same Trump administration, the same Western countries, they keep fueling, keep supporting militarism and nuclear arms race in South Asia.
I'm going to assume, just like the sort of standard democracy, you've got a liberal and a conservative party. Are there multiple parties,
Yes, in principle, we are not a two-party system.
Yeah.
So we have lots of parties, but we have these two big coalitions around which the Indian politics has kind of cohered for the last 2-3 decades.
Yeah.
So we have two big coalitions and a number of small parties which sometimes keep shifting between these two coalitions.
Okay. Between the two major parties, I'm going to guess that they have a similar policy on nuclear.
Yes. So that's curious. When it comes to nuclear power, these two big coalitions are not very different.
Yeah.
Although when the current ruling party, when it was in opposition, it raised sometimes right kind of noises about nuclear liability and some reservations about the EPR projects. It never questioned nuclear power per se, but it had some limited issue-based reservations. But when the same party comes in power, it exactly does the same things with a much larger force.
Yeah.
So both these big coalitions are completely committed to the misplaced, dangerous, dirty, expensive nuclear dream.
Yeah. Well, and I have to throw in the Canadian parallel where SNC-Lavalin gives to both parties. And as friendly as we see the Canadians right now with SNC-Lavalin, trying to protect them from prosecution, it was Harper who gifted Candu to SNC-Lavalin. So they're all friends of SNC-Lavalin here.
Yeah, That's true about India. That's completely true about India.
Well, thanks again. I hope to have you back on again.
Sure, Dave. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for the time.
Having me. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Have a good Saturday.
Find us on Twitter @thatarcher. Send us an email, archer@twxnet.com. For guest links and contact info, visit our podcast page, tmi.twxnet.com. Find us on Android and Apple Podcast apps. Subscribe and rate the show on iTunes.
I'm Dave Archer in Toronto.
I am Kumar Sundaram from dayanuke.org.